Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. When the Fire Soul arrow exploded, it sent a huge shockwave out in all directions. The long red spear slowed down for a moment, but after completely destroying the arrow, continued on toward Bai Xiaochun. In the blink of an eye, it slammed into him, causing a boom that shook the entire sepulchre. The walls cracked, the floor shattered, and Bai Xiaochun's 30-meter-tall stone golem form collapsed, revealing his true form. He was holding his turtle walk in front of him, coughing up blood as he was flung violently backward. Although he wasn't dead, his internal organs had been crushed, and his bones shattered. Skin and muscle were shredded, and he was left hovering on the brink of death. Bai Xiaochun chuckled bitterly, his eyes flickering with despair. He was well aware that without his turtle walk, he would have been killed moments ago. After all, he was facing a diva. The restorative warmth of the last godly vestige pill he had placed into his mouth earlier was already fading away. He only had one more pill in his bag of holding, which he produced now and put into his mouth. As of this moment, he was out of tricks. If he was injured again, there would be no recovery. And since he was facing repeated attacks at the hands of Mistress Red Dust, that meant that he now had no chances at survival. He had used just about every trick he could think of so far, and all of them were weak at best when used against the power of a diva. And clearly, this Mistress Red Dust was very insistent on seeing him dead. Whether it was the diva soul itself, the knowledge he possessed of how to use such souls, or just the general Wildlands' hatred toward him, she had more than enough reasons to want him killed. The teleportation power was still building up in the sepulchre, but from what Bai Xiaochun could tell, if the battle continued on as it had so far, he wouldn't last until it finished. I can't believe he's not dead. Mistress Red Dust thought. She was really starting to go crazy because of how this fight was progressing. She was a diva, and although there were some mitigating factors to explain why she couldn't kill someone in the great circle of the Gold Core stage, if news spread that he had stood up to her over and over again, it would turn her into a laughingstock. The fact that the walk he had pulled out was capable of blocking her red spear caused Mistress Red Dust's eyes to glitter. However, she didn't hesitate to once again advance on Bai Xiaochun, her cultivation base surging as she summoned a Dharma idol into being behind her. It was an enormous head that bore Mistress Red Dust's features. Devas were vastly more powerful than people beneath them, even without Dharma idols. To summon a Dharma idol would draw significantly on the diva's cultivation base, and would normally only be used when fighting another diva. And yet here, Mistress Red Dust was so anxious to kill Bai Xiaochun that she didn't hesitate to resort to that method. When Bai Xiaochun saw the Dharma idol, his eyes turned even more bloodshot than before, and he smiled a mad smile. I guess there are no more options now. There is only one thing left to do to buy time, one chance to hold out until the teleportation begins and I can flee this death trap. It's going to force me down a one-way path that I'll never be able to come back from, but I have to protect my poor little life. Time to go all out. The madness in Bai Xiaochun's eyes grew as the idea swirled in his mind. As of this moment, he really didn't have any other options available. As Mistress Red Dust closed in with murder in her eyes, Bai Xiaochun let out a shout and slapped his bag of holding, producing a blue and white jade bracelet. Immediately, the diva soul inside the bracelet began to shine with scintillating light. Almost as soon as the bracelet appeared in the open, Mistress Red Dust seemed to realize what he was thinking of doing, and roared, "How dare you, Bai Xiaochun!" At the same time, she picked up speed, reaching back with her right hand to deliver a fierce palm strike. That simple motion caused all of the energy in the entire sepulchre to surge into her palm, which she would then use to crush Bai Xiaochun. Behind her, the Dharma idol's eyes glared menacingly, and it began to race toward him. "You're forcing me to do this, harlot Red Dust!" he yelled angrily. Even as she neared, he unhesitatingly crushed the jade bracelet. As the diva soul floated out, a look of despair could be seen in Bai Xiaochun's eyes as his hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture. Diva Soul Merger. Instantly, the Diva Soul shot toward him, merging into his chest. However, that was when Mistress Red Dust's palm arrived, collapsing the air around him, shattering everything, and shoving him backward, blood spraying from his mouth, hair flying around wildly. His chest caved in, instantly revealing the flesh and blood beneath his flayed skin. At the same time, shocking fluctuations began to spread out from inside of Bai Xiaochun, and then a double image of himself appeared, which stepped out in front of him. It looked exactly like him, as if a second Bai Xiaochun had suddenly appeared. Diva Soul Clone. Mistress Red Dust exclaimed, the killing intent in her eyes growing stronger. It most definitely was a Diva Soul clone of Bai Xiaochun, with a complete cultivation base that was virtually exactly the same as Bai Xiaochun's. His first action was to protectively grab his own true self and flee from Mistress Red Dust. The clone was also bleeding and injured, but he gritted his teeth and unleashed all the speed he could muster. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun's true self didn't hesitate at all about what to do next. It was a moment of deadly crisis, and Mistress Red Dust's fury was blazing, and therefore, he yet again slapped his bag of holding. Fudge. Alright, if I'm gonna absorb Diva Souls, what's the difference between 1 and 2? Alright, Red Dust, you pushed Lord Bai, so he's gonna push you back. To death. Gritting his teeth, he produced the Diva Soul that Du Lingfei had given him and slammed it down onto his chest, using the prescribed method to instantly absorb it. Impossible. Mistress Red Dust's eyes were wide and her mind was reeling. She almost couldn't believe what was happening. Bai Xiaochun actually had an additional Diva Soul. Damn it, she growled, her madness growing. She had just unleashed power sufficient to destroy Bai Xiaochun's true self and clone, and yet, that was when another double image appeared and stepped out. Just when the true self and the water clone were on the verge of being shredded to pieces, the flames of their life force flickering on the verge of eradication, a second clone appeared. This was Bai Xiaochun's fire clone. The fire clone stood directly in front of the water clone, roaring as he drew upon the full power of his cultivation base and battle prowess to fight back against Mistress Red Dust. Only a moment later, blood was spraying out of the fire clone's mouth, and he was bloody and battered. Even his bones were visible, many of them shattered. However, the time he had bought ensured that Bai Xiaochun's true self was still alive. So what if you have 2 clones? You're still dead. Mistress Red Dust was feeling quite humiliated. The battle so far had been quite a blow to her, and she even regretted how she had conducted herself so far. If she had known before that Bai Xiaochun had 2 Diva Souls, she would simply have allowed the shafts of light to injure her in exchange for the ability to crush him with her full might. What left her more flabbergasted than anything, though, was what happened next. Even as the 2 clones fought back against her with all their power, Bai Xiaochun's true self pulled out another Diva Soul, this one in the form of a green, jade walnut, which he crushed into his chest. As soon as he merged with the Diva Soul, a third clone stepped out. It was none other than a wood clone. 3 clones stood with Bai Xiaochun's true self to defend against Mistress Red Dust, howling and fighting back with unyielding defiance. Mistress Red Dust was herself on the verge of collapsing mentally at the absurd sight in front of her. To her, Bai Xiaochun was like some sort of freak. Not even in her dreams could she ever have imagined that a person like him would have so many Diva Souls. Impossible. Why you? You have how many Diva Souls? Mistress Red Dust's heart was in physical pain, and the regret she currently felt went all the way to the deepest level of her being. I don't care how many Diva Souls you have, Mistress Red Dust shrieked. I wouldn't care if you had a heaven-down nascent soul cultivation base. Today is the day you're going to die. Mistress Red Dust's face was distorted with such madness that it seemed even her aura was negatively affected. As she yelled, her Dharma idol grew larger, transforming into a sun which began to rumble toward Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun's true self was joined by 3 clones to fight back against a single Diva-level palm strike being delivered by Mistress Red Dust. With even one less clone, all of them would have been killed in body and soul. Although death still seemed to be an inevitability, at least they were able to delay that dismal outcome for a bit longer than before. Thankfully, it was in that very moment that, as the sepulchre collapsed into nothing around them, the teleportation spell formation was completely and fully activated within the sepulchre. The glow of teleportation began to rise up around everyone present, whether they were in the tunnels, the area surrounding the trials by fire, or in the sepulchre itself. Anyone and everyone that was still alive was being wrapped up in the teleportation power. Back in the realm of the trials by fire, the combined efforts of Chen Hichan and everyone else present had resulted in them being able to break the barrier surrounding the void they were in. And yet, to their surprise, the only thing they found beyond that barrier was another void. However, despair was not in order, as the light of teleportation began to build up around them, leading to sighs of relief on the part of all present. We can finally get out of here. Yeah, but considering how enormous the spell formation must be, who knows where we'll end up afterward. What are you scared of? We're all members of the holy people, we'll be fine as long as we end up somewhere in the wildlands. Heh. How do you know we won't be transported into the lands of Heavenspan? Such talk rose up everywhere within the labyrinth. Everyone was feeling much more relaxed now that the teleportation was beginning. Of course, the light of teleportation was also there around Bai Xiaochun and Mistress Red Dust, causing Bai Xiaochun's expression to brighten, but Mistress Red Dust's eyes to blaze with fury. If Bai Xiaochun got away now, before she had used all the power she had at her disposal, it would be the greatest humiliation of her life. That in itself caused her fury to burn hotter than ever. "You're not going anywhere, Bai Xiaochun," she screamed. Then her Dharma idol began to pick up speed, causing rumbling sounds to echo out as it closed in on Bai Xiaochun, threatening to turn him and everything around him into nothing more than ash. The moment that the teleportation light had appeared, Bai Xiaochun had assumed that he'd held out long enough, and finally had hope of surviving. But when he saw the Dharma idol speeding toward him, he suddenly realized that his hope was like a candle flickering in the wind, with that wind being imminent destruction. How could I possibly die in this place? His eyes were so bloodshot that they were pure crimson, and that included his 3 clones in addition to his true self. Bai Xiaochun's true self threw his head back and roared, disregarding all matters of safety pertaining to his cultivation base or his spiritual power. As if this moment, none of that mattered. If he didn't get past this moment, he would be dead forever. "Living mountain incantation," shouted his true self. Despite being seriously injured, rumbling sounds surrounded him as he transformed into a 30-meter-tall giant. At the same time, his 3 clones echoed his words. "Living mountain incantation, living mountain incantation, living mountain incantation." All 3 of the clones transformed into 30-meter-tall stone golems. Then, even as the 4 stone golems prepared to defend against the incoming attack, the clones joined their voices with his true selves to shout, "Water swamp kingdom." 4 stone golems performed incantation gestures and then shoved their hands down toward the sepulchre floor, causing the entire area to turn into a watery swamp. In fact, the borders of the swamp seemed to go past the edges of the sepulchre and out into the void beyond, as though this weren't a single water swamp kingdom, but rather, 4. As the 4 water swamp kingdoms expanded and then merged into each other, they became a watery swamp that was 4 times larger than the original. That was a huge difference. Almost immediately, a roar erupted out from the water swamp kingdom, as if from ancient times. The sound alone caused Mistress Red Dust's face to fall, and was so loud that it reached the locations outside the trials by fire, and the labyrinth as a whole. "Come forth, my life essence spirit," Bai Xiaochun shouted, throwing his head back and laughing madly. His voice was a bit hoarse, and he was physically shaking. His cultivation base and life force were being drained madly, and it was the same with the 3 clones, and yet, that was when something came out of the watery swamp that did not look like the spikes from before. 5 twisted mountains could be seen, and yet, closer examination would reveal that they were no mountains. It was the clawed hand of some enormous beast, with talons as pitch black as night. As the 5 talons stretched up, it was possible to see further down into the watery swamp, to what appeared to be a forest-like stretch of pitch-black hair, beneath which was green skin. However, because of the incredible size of the clawed hand, even a water swamp kingdom that was quadruple its normal size was still not large enough for it to fit through. Only the claws could emerge into the open, where they shot toward the incoming palm and Dharma idol. Were anyone capable of illustrating this scene, it would have been completely shocking to behold. When the 5 talons touched the Dharma idol in the palm, it was the palm which began to tremble first, and then collapse into pieces. As for the sun-like Dharma idol, it erupted with radiant light and a powerful shockwave that rippled out in all directions. Anything that remained of the sepulchre was smashed into rubble and sent spinning into the pitch-black void beyond. In fact, that made it possible to see Chen Hichan and the others far off in the distance, who had long since noticed what was happening, and were looking on in complete shock. The shockwave sent Bai Xiaochun stumbling backward, his stone golem form crumbling to reveal his true form. Blood sprayed out of his mouth as his 3 clones became white motes of light that spun back into his true self. Bai Xiaochun could tell that all of the clones were seriously injured. Half of his water clone's body had been destroyed, his fire clone's chest was completely caved in, and worst off was his wood clone, of whom only half a head remained. Although his true self remained completely intact, he was also severely injured. Most of his bones were crushed, and the majority of his flesh and blood had been destroyed. Even his skull was cracked and on the verge of shattering. Thankfully, he had used his living mountain incantation right before summoning the Water Swamp Kingdom, otherwise he would have been killed, and not just injured. He and all of his clones would have been rendered into nothing more than dust. Bai Xiaochun didn't even have the energy to smile bitterly. His vision was fading, and he couldn't move. He could also sense the flame of his life force teetering on the verge of being extinguished. If he had plenty of time to rest, the power of his fleshly body would ensure that he could recover. But at the moment, he had used every trick in his book, and had nothing left. Off in the distance, Chen Hichan and the others looked on with gaping jaws. Zhao Tianzhao and Chen Yushan were completely wrapped up in their anxiety, and Chen Hichan's pupils were tiny dots. As for Zhou Yixing, he looked quite excited. Your comeuppance is at hand, Bai Xiaochun. Zhou Yixing hadn't seen Bai Xiaochun's clones, nor had anyone else. Nobody had really been able to see clearly everything that just happened. It was in that very moment that an incredible rumbling sound filled the entire area. The light of teleportation grew dazzlingly bright, and even before Zhou Yixing could laugh out loud, he began to fade away. So did everyone else. Bai Xiaochun was finally completely gripped by the power of teleportation and began to disappear. Bai Xiaochun, Mistress Red Dust screamed, her hair whipping around her as she took a step forward. Usually, Mistress Red Dust was beautiful, with a curvaceous body, the fairest of skin, and entrancing eyes. But right now, she was bedraggled, shaking, and seriously injured. On top of that, she was furious. Never before could she possibly have imagined that Bai Xiaochun would turn out to be so difficult to kill. She was covered with red welts, the result of trying to fight in the middle of dealing with a curse. For a beautiful woman like her, such a thing was a heavy price to pay. Although she was confident in being able to dispel the effects of the curse eventually, the pain and numbness she felt because of it right now had her going mad with fury. Bai Xiaochun, she screamed, her hatred for him taking root in the very marrow of her bones. As of this moment, she could not live under the same sky with him. It didn't matter that they were still surrounded by the dazzling light of teleportation, the fact that he wasn't dead yet caused her eyes to shine with insanity as she took another step forward toward him. She had to kill him before he teleported away. She could never rest easy with him alive. Before, she had disliked him because of his soul convergence pills and exploding pill furnaces, as well as the general humiliation and pain he had caused to the wildlands. Furthermore, the actions of the Soul Tide and the True Spirit in Great Wall City had put a significant dent in her years of accomplishments in the war, which caused further hatred in her heart toward Bai Xiaochun. However, considering the level of her cultivation base, and the fact that Bai Xiaochun was like a bug beneath her, none of those things had really mattered very much. He would be killed eventually, and his meddling wouldn't cause any permanent problems for the war effort. But now, things were different. If it had been anyone else in that sepulchre, even a nascent soul cultivator, they would never have survived in a fight against her. And yet Bai Xiaochun had. Not only had he survived, he had left her bruised and injured. Plus, he had revealed the fact that he had 3 diva souls, a fact that left her completely unsettled. He's keeping some big secret, and if he brings it to fruition, then given enough time, he'll be so terrifying that today's events will seem like nothing. He'll bring about disaster after disaster. I've already reached the point where I can't live under the same sky as him. How could I possibly let him get away now? Gritting her teeth and ignoring the fact that she was already starting to fade away because of the teleportation power, she edged closer to Bai Xiaochun. Then she reached out with her hand. This was the moment in which she would eradicate him, ending his life once and for all. Only then would she feel at ease. After all, considering how difficult it had been to kill him in this state, if he grew stronger, he would be even more terrifying. It was a moment of critical danger for Bai Xiaochun. Despite being in the middle of teleportation, with his body fading away, at the current speed with which Mistress Red Dust was moving, it seemed highly likely that she would strike him before he vanished. Then, it wouldn't matter that he was teleported away, the only thing to be teleported would be a corpse. In that moment, Bai Xiaochun's listless eyes suddenly sparkled, and he drew upon the last little bit of life force he had left. He couldn't move his body, and his cultivation base was completely stagnant. The injuries to his fleshly body were severe. However, he didn't want to die. He wanted to live. There were so many things he had yet to do in life, and to accomplish them, he needed to live forever. I want to live forever. I can't die. Roaring inwardly, he closed his 2 eyes and opened the 3rd eye on his forehead, his heaven-span Dharma eye. Furthermore, it wasn't just his true self who did it. Inside of him, his 3 clones also opened their heaven-span Dharma eyes. The power of 4 heaven-span Dharma eyes merged together and shot out toward Mistress Red Dust. Rumble. Instantly, control power surged out. Despite the fact that it filled his entire body with intense pain, he ignored that and focused his gaze fully on Mistress Red Dust. Rumbling sounds continued as she lurched to a halt. Although she recovered a moment later, that moment was all the time that was needed. Blood oozed out of Bai Xiaochun's heaven-span Dharma eye as the power of teleportation surged. Grabbing the eternal parasol just in the nick of time, he vanished. As for the magical technique that Mistress Red Dust had just been preparing, it shot through the space that had previously been occupied by Bai Xiaochun, and did absolutely nothing. Bai Xiaochun, she screamed shrilly, her eyes burning with hatred. Then, a moment later, she also vanished. At the same time, teleportation light swept through the rest of the labyrinth, causing everyone else to disappear, including Master God Diviner, Zhao Long, Song Ke, and others. Great Wall cultivators, soul cultivators, and savage giants alike were all whisked away as the labyrinth collapsed, leaving behind nothing but a huge, sinking crater. Within that enormous area, the space that had once been created by the 9 black pillars of light was replaced by a single white pillar that shot into the sky and then sent ripples out in all directions. Violin and the Great Wall forces, as well as all the people from the wildlands, all clearly saw what was happening, and were shaken. Furthermore, all of them very much wanted to know what occurred within the labyrinth. It wasn't until a month later that everyone came to know about the teleportation spell formation which had been activated, and how everyone inside had been teleported to different parts of the wildlands. Some people ended up in areas relatively close to the labyrinth, others were sent deep into the wildlands, to places where transmission jade slips were useless. As more and more Great Wall cultivators managed to make it back to Great Wall City, news began to spread about what happened in the trials by fire. Stories of Bai Xiaochun began to be told again, causing the news to resound in Great Wall City and the wildlands alike. He had taken first place in the trials by fire. He had been the first to enter the sepulchre. Later, Mistress Red Dust also entered the sepulchre, where the two had fought a bitter battle. After the sepulchre collapsed, it was revealed that Bai Xiaochun had apparently survived the fight up to that point. But then the teleportation began, and as for whether or not he made out it alive, nobody knew. After a second month passed, Mistress Red Dust increased the reward on Bai Xiaochun's head to an unheard of level. 5 Diva Beast Souls and 1 Diva Soul. Both the Wildlands and the Great Wall forces were completely shaken. Not even the Great Wall's execution list had a reward so high. Bai Xiaochun was now in first place on the Wildlands execution list. It was also in that fashion that the Great Wall forces came to realize that Bai Xiaochun was not dead. Currently, Bai Lin sat in Great Wall City, a melancholy look on his face and an alcohol flagon in hand. Sighing emotionally, he murmured, "As long as you're not dead, Xiaochun, I'm happy. I really let you down this time. Where are you?" The wildlands were huge, so huge that few people even knew their true extent. However, most cultivators who understood a thing or two about them were able to guess. If the entire world were circular, then the heaven-span sea would be in the very middle, with 4 enormous rivers stretching out from it in each of the cardinal directions. The tributaries, streams and even the deltas were all like tree branches that grew out from the rivers. The areas in which the Heavenspan River existed were the Heavenspan realm. The places where that river didn't exist occupied roughly half of the circle that made up the world. And those locations were known as the Wildlands. There was even a well-known saying, "Everything beyond the Great Wall is the Wildlands." In the areas between the 4 major rivers were the 4 major sections of the Great Wall, which acted like gates, keeping the Wildlands locked on the outside, and the Heavenspan realm sealed on the inside. If one could look down from high enough, the 4 sections of the Great Wall would make something like a large circle. More precisely, there were 2 circles. The inner circle was the Heavenspan realm, and the outer circle was the Wildlands. Theoretically speaking, if one kept walking for long enough, they could walk in a huge circle through the wildlands. As such, it was also possible to reach any of the 4 major rivers without even setting foot on a boat. 1. Somewhere deep in the wildlands, there was a boundless jungle, dense to the extreme, filled with countless towering trees that formed an enormous canopy overhead. Because of that canopy, only scattered bits of sunlight made it through to the rotting marshlands below. Enormous jungles like this existed in numerous locations within the wildlands. Although such areas were devoid of the spiritual power of the Heavenspan River, they still teemed with life. In fact, whether it was the plant life or the local savages, everything seemed to be free of certain constraints that spiritual power brought, and thus were especially large and tough. One particularly large tree in this jungle had bones littering the ground beneath it, many of which had bite marks on them. There were also the scattered feathers of flying creatures. In the middle of all the bones, leaning up against the tree itself, was a person. His hair was messy and knotted, and he was devouring the carcass of some small creature. The crunching sounds of his chewing were terrifying as they echoed out into the jungle. Apparently, he was so hungry that he didn't care whether or not he was eating the flesh or the bones, or both. Considering all the bones surrounding this person, it seemed that he had eaten quite a bit during this meal. It was a really frightening scene. Not too far away, beneath another large tree, was a corpse. Clearly, that corpse had been laying there rotting for many weeks. It was so withered up that it was difficult to make out its facial features, but based on the clothing, it had been a cultivator in life. There was even a bag of holding laying off to the side next to the corpse. The living person devouring the raw meat was none other than Bai Xiaochun. As for the corpse, not even Bai Xiaochun had any idea who it was. Bai Xiaochun had been teleported to this location on a stormy night roughly 2 months before. Considering how badly injured he had been, he had struggled just to crawl over to the base of the tree. Using his last scrap of spiritual power, he had pulled out his damaged eternal parasol and stabbed it into the ground next to him, relying on the pressure it emanated to protect himself. Having been completely drained of spiritual power, he simply lay there, unmoving. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun noticed a young man lying on the ground at the base of another nearby tree. At that point, the young man had not been dead. He had stared in disbelief at Bai Xiaochun for a long moment, neither of them talking, until he finally leaned his head down onto the ground and died. Seeing the young man die had frightened Bai Xiaochun, but at that moment, he had been too weak to even move. The emotion of the moment, combined with his exhaustion, had shoved him into unconsciousness. He didn't wake up for almost a week. Unfortunately, he was still too weak to move at that time. His injuries were truly severe, and he had been pushed to the very brink of death, leaving him completely empty of any sort of spiritual power. To recover would definitely require time. After all, he didn't even have enough spiritual power to open his bag of holding. He was surrounded by the corpses of various wild animals, which he didn't remember seeing there when he had passed out earlier. Clearly, the animals had come too close to the eternal parasol, and had been killed by the pressure it emitted. Furthermore, the power of the parasol had also protected the corpse of the young man at the other nearby tree. It's a good thing that I ended up pulling the eternal parasol out of my bag of holding instead of something else. Otherwise, I would have woken up to find myself eaten. He sighed bitterly, his heart filled with anger. To think that a magnificent major general like myself would fall to this level. You'll get what's coming to you one of these days, Granny Red Dust. I'll show you how awesome Lord Bai is. And as for you Chen Hachan, you and I are now archenemies. I really got hurt badly this time. Bai Xiaochun wanted to cry, and at the same time, felt his fury building. However, he couldn't even turn his head, only move his eyes around to examine his unfamiliar surroundings. Eventually, he forced himself to accept his current situation, and also realized that since there was no spiritual energy, he was obviously not near the Heavenspan River. Clearly, he had been teleported out into the wildlands. After a while, he sighed. Feeling bored, he rolled his eyes over to look at the corpse lying beneath the tree. Earlier, it had been impossible to determine what had caused the young man's death. But now his skin was pitch black, leading to the obvious conclusion that he had been hit with a poisonous magical technique that had burned his heart and blood vessels until he died. Suddenly, another wave of exhaustion swept through Bai Xiaochun, and he passed out again. Another week or so went by before we woke up, but this time, he could move his head a bit. Furthermore, he didn't feel completely numb. In fact, he felt little stabs of pain all over himself, almost like needles. It was a somewhat unbearable feeling, and yet, he could do little more than sigh. Well, at least I can feel pain. That means I'm slowly recovering. There were more animal corpses piled up in the area now, and he was so hungry he felt dizzy. Unfortunately, he could only move his head, nothing else. Swallowing, he lay there blankly for a bit before looking back at the corpse to analyze it a bit further. It looks like he was in early Foundation establishment. Doesn't look like he was teleported here from the labyrinth. More like a local soul cultivator. Seems like he was fleeing for his life from somebody or something. Bai Xiaochun wasn't too worried about that fact. After all, he had already been laying in one place for about half a month without anyone passing by. As time passed, and Bai Xiaochun continued to watch the corpse rotting away, he picked up on more and more clues. Doesn't seem like a rogue cultivator. Must be from some local cultivator clan. I remember looking at him right before he died. He looked haggard and defiant. He must have had some aspirations in life that he never fulfilled. Seems pretty young, smart and good looking, although not as much as me. He often muttered things like this to himself. After all, as he was slowly recovering, he literally had nothing to do except study the corpse. When he got tired, he would go back to sleep. Eventually, 2 months later, he was excited to discover that he could move again. The first thing he did was crawl over one of the animals that had been killed because of the eternal parasol. He devoured the entire thing in a single mouthful. Over the course of the past 2 months, he had become so hungry he could barely see straight. That was compounded by the fact that his recovery was rapidly emptying him out. Therefore, he ate all of the nearby animals in a single sitting. He even ate the tiny birds, feathers and all. The more he ate, the warmer he felt, and the more energy he had. In the end, after devouring everything in sight, he rubbed the back of his neck and finally felt alive again. "I'm back," he yelled excitedly. It was a wonderful feeling to escape with one's life against all odds. As he thought back to everything which had happened in the labyrinth, it truly felt as if he had ended up stepping halfway through the gates of the underworld. Sighing, he walked over to the corpse. "Thank you for keeping me company these past 2 months, my brother," he said softly. "I guess it was fate that we met here. If I ever have the chance, I'll do my best to pay you back." Reaching down, he picked up the bag of holding lying next to the corpse. Meanwhile, on a barren mountain some distance away from the jungle, someone was sitting cross-legged in meditation, in a cave. There were 7 or 8 corpses laid out in front of him, all of them belonging to Foundation establishment cultivators. They were little more than skin and bones, with their flesh and blood having been absorbed. Eventually, the cross-legged figure's eyes opened, although instead of shining brightly, they glimmered with faded life, as if this person had received significant injuries. Ignoring the corpses, he rubbed his forehead and gritted his teeth. "Even if you're dead, Bai Xiaochun, one of these days I'll pay you back for the humiliation you brought upon me. I'll avenge myself upon your friends and family, 1,000 times over." He was none other than Zhou Yixing. 1. Early descriptions of the lands of Heavenspan refer to how the areas between the rivers are devoid of spiritual energy. I think that the idea is that those areas are within the Great Wall, and are more like dead zones, as opposed to being part of the wildlands. If anyone remembers any specific passages which seem to contradict this, or contradict the description in this chapter, please let me know so that I can go back to clarify and adjust the narrative. Bai Xiaochun stood there in the jungle, holding the bag of holding and looking down at the corpse of the young man. For some reason, he really felt as if it had been destiny which teleported him to this location, where this corpse had accompanied him for 2 months. He sighed. "Allow me to give you a proper burial, my brother." Bai Xiaochun could tell that he was recovering rapidly now. However, his spiritual power was still so depleted that he couldn't even open his bag of holding. Therefore, he used the eternal parasol to dig a pit, into which he lowered the corpse of the young man. Patting the soil he had filled the grave back in with, he said, "Don't worry, in a few more days I should have enough spiritual power built up to open your bag of holding. Then we can see what's inside, and maybe I'll even learn your name. Then I can put up a proper grave marker for you." Then he walked back over to the tree he had spent the last 2 months under and sat down cross-legged to try out some breathing exercises. Unfortunately, there wasn't any spiritual power in this part of the wildlands, so he was forced to rely only on the restorative powers of his own body, and the bits of spiritual energy which had built up in his flesh and blood over the years. A few days passed. It was early evening, but because of the darkness that blanketed the jungle floor, it seemed like the middle of the night. As Bai Xiaochun sat there meditating, he slowly opened his eyes, and a brief flicker of light could be seen. Got some spiritual power back. His heart was pounding with excitement. After all, he was in a strange land bereft of spiritual power, and that left him feeling very uneasy. Panting a bit, he slapped his bag of holding, which flashed with light as a bottle flew out. It was a bottle of spirit alcohol. He excitedly poured the spirit alcohol down his throat, whereupon it turned into warm currents that flowed through his chi passageways in a very pleasing fashion. He was like a dried, parched land that was finally receiving rain, and it caused prickling sensations to fill him. "That's the feeling," he murmured, tears welling up in his eyes. Taking a deep breath, he rotated his cultivation base, not allowing a bit of the spiritual power from the spirit alcohol to go to waste. A few hours later, Bai Xiaochun was laughing madly, his eyes glittering at the small fraction of spiritual power which he had built up, which was only about 5% of his total limit. Although it was only a small amount, it was enough to open his bag of holding numerous times. Therefore, he opened the bag again to pull out a dozen or so bottles of spirit alcohol, consumed them all, and then sat quietly to perform breathing exercises. For the following 3 days, rumbling sounds filled him as spiritual power poured through his body. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes, and tears flowed out. "I've finally recovered completely. Man, that was hard. Whether it's in terms of body or cultivation base, I'm back to normal. You just wait for Lord Bai to get his hands on you, Granny Red Dust." Laughing loudly, he stood up and assessed his spiritual power levels. To his delight, he found that he was actually a bit stronger than before. Thanks to the deadly battle he had fought, his position within the great circle of the gold core stage had advanced, both in terms of fleshly body power and cultivation base. In fact, when it came to his fleshly body, he felt more than ever that he was on the verge of being able to break through the next shackle. He couldn't help but sigh, especially when he thought back to how closely he had brushed with death during his fight with Mistress Red Dust. Taking a deep breath, he looked around a bit, which was when his excitement began to wane, and he even started to feel a bit anxious. I don't even have any idea where I am in the wildlands. Wherever I am, it's too dangerous here. I need to get back to the Great Wall. Now that he thought about it, if any of the soul cultivators or savages found out that he was Bai Xiaochun, they would surely skin him alive. The mere thought of what that would be like left him shivering. Finally, he looked over at the simple grave he had erected, and finally decided to open the bag of holding that had belonged to the young man. It contained a variety of miscellaneous items, few of which were of any interest to Bai Xiaochun. After all, it was the bag of holding of a mere early Foundation establishment cultivator. However, what did interest Bai Xiaochun was the collection of bone slips. Much like jade slips, they could store information, and after skimming through the group in the bag of holding, Bai Xiaochun found 3 that were of particular interest. The first bone slip contained a map of the immediate area. After studying it for a while, Bai Xiaochun still had no idea where he was. There was absolutely nothing on the map that indicated how far away the Great Wall was. Well, that doesn't help much, he thought nervously. With that, he moved on to the second bone slip, after which his eyes glittered, and he looked over at the grave mound. Your name is Bai Hao? He murmured. The second bone slip had some detailed information about the identity of the dead young man, including some dying words he had inscribed. 1. His name was Bai Hao, and was a bastard son from one of the local aristocratic necromancer clans. Apparently, he wasn't very well liked in the clan, and had provoked the ire of the wrong people who plotted against him. That was what led to him perishing when and how he did. From what Bai Xiaochun could tell, the necromancer clan in question wasn't considered to be spectacularly famous. Aristocratic necromancer clan. After some more thought, he moved on to the third bone slip, which contained the most intriguing information so far. It was a detailed description of necromancers, with information he had wondered about back at the Great Wall. Essentially, it was a basic primer to necromancy. Even the first few sentences left Bai Xiaochun completely shaken. Necromancy is an amalgamation. Necromancers use the foundation of spirit enhancement, medicine concocting, and equipment forging as the basis of necromancy. Bai Xiaochun had long since noticed that there was something strange about the spirit-enhanced treasures wielded by the Wildlanders, and had come to his own conclusions about why that was. Now, the information in this bone slip corroborated his previous speculations. After going on to read through the rest of the information, he was left stunned. At that point, the Wildlands didn't seem as profoundly mysterious as they had before. All of the various clues suddenly fit together to form a complete picture. The lowest of the low in the Wildlands were the savage tribes. The giants had been the last to become civilized, and were treated mostly like servants. They actually worshipped the soul cultivators, and viewed them as protectors of sorts. Soul cultivators occupied a much higher position than the savages, and were not very different from ordinary cultivators. The only difference was that they couldn't practice cultivation with the spiritual power of the Heavenspan River, and instead had to rely on the soul vitality provided by the necromancers. In the sprawling wildlands, there were far more savages than soul cultivators, and yet, the soul cultivators couldn't be described as few and far between. They had their clans and powerful organizations, and there were also many who were like rogue cultivators. As for the necromancers, they were like the nobility of the wildlands. Any necromancer of any sort occupied a very high position. Not only could they produce the soul vitality that soul cultivators needed to advance their cultivation, but they could also forge magical items and bless such items with spirit enhancements. Because of that, necromancers were extremely important to the wildlands as a whole. Of course, necromancers had their own ranking system based on fire. The truth was that although Wildlands necromancers resembled the spirit enhancers from the lands of Heavenspan in some ways, they were actually very different. In the lands of Heavenspan, spirit enhancers would search for fuel to make multicolored flame. However, the necromancers didn't need any fuel. Although they also experienced a similar issue of having a high failure rate, they didn't need to rely on fuel, they worked directly with the flame itself. Of course, such flames didn't exist on their own. Necromancers used different types of souls and special methods to conjure them. Anyone who could conjure one colored flame was considered an initiate necromancer. Upon being able to conjure 4-colored flame, one was promoted to the journeyman rank. 7-colored flame was the standard to become a master necromancer. Most necromancers in the wildlands fell into those 3 ranks. 10-colored flame was the absolute peak for master necromancers, and not very many necromancers could reach such a level. After going beyond that level, necromancers would experience a period of transformation, after which, they were ranked according to the denominations of terrestrial, celestial, earthly, and heavenly. Being able to conjure 11-colored flame made one a terrestrial necromancer. In the wildlands, any terrestrial necromancer was a person who could dominate the lands wherever he went. The next level beyond that was the celestial necromancer, of which there were even fewer. In any of the necromancer clans, a celestial necromancer occupied the highest of positions, similar to that of a grand elder or the reserve powers. After all, the hallmark of celestial necromancers was the ability to conjure 15-colored flame. Earthly necromancers were legendary, and in all of the wildlands, there were only 3. To become an earthly necromancer, one had to conjure 18-colored flame. The highest level of all was that of the heavenly necromancer. From ancient times until now, not a single one had ever appeared, and they were considered only a theoretical rank. After all, to reach the heavenly rank, one had to conjure 21-colored flame. 1. Bai Hao's surname is the same as Bai Xiaochun's, which means white. The character Hao is the same character as Meng Hao and Fang Hao from I Shall Seal the Heavens. It means great, vast, grand. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.